Thank you for the introduction. As Philip mentioned, I'm originally a scientist, a material physicist, and so a lot of this talk is going to focus on material issues at play. Not so much with, as Philip mentioned, achieving nuclear abolition or complete nuclear disarmament, but more on the ground issues of what you actually do once you've made a nuclear weapon or a chemical weapon, if you later want that weapon to no longer exist. Of course, as you all know, a lot of really technical work goes into the synthesis of plutonium, for example, but getting rid of that plutonium is in many ways equally difficult. So in this case, I'm going to be talking about two different weapon stockpiles in the United States, chemical and nuclear arsenals, and some of the efforts that have gone into eliminating portions of those arsenals. But I'm also going to focus beyond the material conditions involved on the social issues at play. And one of the big themes of this talk is that while it might not be immediately apparent, those social issues really matter and in many cases seem to be the determining factors in the success or failure of stockpile reduction efforts. So looking at it broadly, stockpile reductions form the back end of the arms control cycle, defining in a general sense arms control as some sort of limitation on the development, production, proliferation, use, or stockpiling of arms or weapons. Achieving limitations on the first four are relatively simple. This involves just not doing something. You don't develop the weapon, you don't proliferate it, spread it around, you don't use it, for example. So those are negative actions. Once you have produced a stockpile, ceasing to do this fifth action, stockpiling, is more difficult. That requires some sort of active action to achieve stockpile reductions with some reasonable degree of irreversibility to make clear that you no longer possess that stockpile. And while this is difficult, it's also quite important because it's these stockpile reductions that really make permanent any arms control or arms prohibition progress that is made. For example, New START and the SORT treaties and all of these have removed thousands of weapons from deployment. For those weapons, the warheads that were loaded on those missiles still exist, so re-uploading, reintegration of those into the arsenal is a relatively simple matter if you don't achieve this back end of the process, ceasing to have weapons stockpiled. Now, while it's difficult, there are many examples of stockpile reductions that have occurred throughout history. One of the earliest and actually the most interesting is after the Second Punic War between Rome and Carthage. Carthage's war elephants were slaughtered under a peace treaty with Rome. So this is the elimination of a stockpile of what at the time was a weapon of mass destruction in many ways. More recently, under the Washington Naval Treaty, warships were destroyed by Japan, Italy, the United States, France, and Russia. Of course, under INF, missiles and launchers were dismantled, and under CFE, a number of conventional arms were destroyed. In all of these cases, the means of elimination, even though we're looking at very disparate weapon systems, were really similar. You just disassemble that weapon if, in the case of war elephants, you adopt a kind of broad view of what disassembly might mean. That's changed a bit in the WMD era since the advent of weapons in which weaponizability is embodied, not in the assembly of the weapon itself, but rather in the synthesis of exotic materials like highly effective chemical agents or fissile materials like weapons-grade plutonium. In this case, that weaponizability is fixed somehow in the material, making it more difficult to undo because it's relatively easy to disassemble a warhead, for example, but undoing the creation of weapons plutonium is a serious challenge. And this has some quite dire implications for arms control. Stockpiles are more persistent than they would be if weaponizability was not embodied in these materials. It's relatively easy to cut apart a tank or a missile. It's much more difficult to undo the synthesis of plutonium. So if we look at the plutonium inventory as an example, this has grown monotonically for decades. And we have similar situations for chemical weapons and some biological agents. Many of them are actually much easier to destroy simply by heating, but some are quite resilient under a variety of extreme environments. So it's WMDs in general that have this new challenge. And so there are some open questions here that haven't been analyzed in too much detail. Actually, one of the reasons I'm here is because Philip convened a workshop that did some work on this, looking in Syria, for example, on cases where stockpiles have been destroyed. But in most of those cases, this was a destruction, a stockpile reduction that was imposed by an external force. What I'm really interested in here is how do possessors actually pursue reductions once they have an arsenal that they've decided is no longer desirable to possess, whether for arms control reasons or norm reasons or whatever. How do they achieve that? Why do they choose particular methods of elimination? And what factors tend to govern whether those elimination drives are successful or not? Because there are many examples of failed elimination efforts. This is quite a difficult mission to achieve. There are some challenges in analyzing this. First of all, there is a paucity of cases. Not so many states have WMDs of any type in the first place, and most of those that do have not destroyed them. There are only a few cases we can look at. And then there's the secrecy issue, where even when states do destroy these, they often don't talk much about it. They don't want to publicize the particulars of the management of their nuclear weapon or chemical weapon or biological weapon stockpiles. So the approach I adopt here is a critical instance case study, which is ideal for analyzing situations where there are just a few cases with broad similarities but some key divergences. Here I'll be talking about divergence in outcomes, so cases that are similar in their particulars, but one was successful, one was a failure. And what we'll be doing is looking at critical bifurcations between these two cases to try and test the explanatory power of different analytical frameworks, which I'll go over in more detail a bit later. The two cases I'm going to look at are both US cases because there is a lot of data available about these relative to most other stockpile reductions that have occurred. And I'm going to look at chemical and weapons plutonium stockpile reductions. They are broadly similar. The origins of these both stockpiles is Cold War legacies. The legal context for reductions with an international agreement mandating either the CWC for chemical weapons or an agreement with the PMDA that we'll get into later for weapons plutonium. And they both encountered almost identical cost growth from initial projections of a few $1 billion to eventual roughly $40 billion projected costs, which caused a lot of the challenges involved in achieving, or in one case not achieving, these reductions. But they differ in that chemical disarmament is nearing completion. About 90% of the stockpile has been destroyed as of today, whereas the plutonium stockpile remains undiminished despite decades of work. Not a single gram of weapons-grade plutonium has been eliminated. So now I'll use a few different analytic methods in going through this and looking at this problem that I'm going to go over now, and then for the rest of the presentation I'm going to look at one by one these different frameworks for analyzing this problem. And it's important to use this kind of multifaceted approach because this is a multifaceted process. Stockpile reductions, you need to develop new technologies for eliminating these materials, which is a technologically demanding task. You need to adapt organizations that were previously responsible for producing and maintaining these stockpiles to now get rid of them, which is a very challenging thing to do organizationally. And finally, you need to make sure that this entire activity is somehow aligned with sociopolitical discourses, narratives, and preferences regarding whether you want to have a stockpile in the first place, the desirability or undesirability of this material, and the strategic role that it plays. So to analyze at these three different levels, I'm going to use a hierarchical network approach, where we move from the weapons material itself to, at a higher level, the organization managing it and the stockpile reduction effort, and finally the socio-political environment in which this reduction is pursued. And so I'm going to divide this into three facets: the technology or the material itself, organization, the socio-political environment, and analyze these three issues through three analytic lenses, the first being the science and engineering of chemical agents and nuclear fissile materials. Second, organization theory, and finally, borrowing from the sociology of technology to look at the social environment in which this occurs. And so I'll come back to this when I get to each of these different analyses to reorient you. But for now, I'm going to go briefly through the history of both stockpile reduction efforts, the chemical weapons disarmament process, and the attempted weapons plutonium elimination process. Starting with chemical weapons. So the stockpile was initially developed starting in the First World War when chemical weapons were broadly used. Being uniquely suited to trench warfare, this gave rise to what has been termed a unique moral repugnance to their use, which sort of transitioned these weapons away from tools of wartime to tools of deterrence. The 1925 Geneva Protocol banned their first use, making them explicitly weapons of deterrence, and while they weren't being used any longer, the US did not use chemical weapons in the Second World War. Production continued and stockpiling continued until 1968, meaning that these were desirable weapons to deter in-kind use, so to deter chemical weapons used by adversaries. This resulted in a large US stockpile consisting primarily of nerve agents such as sarin and vesicants or blister agents like the sulfur mustards. These were and are stored primarily in artillery shells, as shown on the right here at the Colorado Depot, and in 1-ton tanks of the agent itself. These are distributed among, or were distributed among 9 Army depots, currently 2 remain. So initial disposal efforts were relatively primitive. There was no concerted effort to reduce the size of the stockpile, but aging munitions and the like did necessitate some minimum level of disposal. Early disposal methods prior to 1970 involved rudimentary techniques like burning in open pits, venting to the atmosphere, or most prevalently ocean dumping. So under Operation Chase, which was an acronym standing for Cut Holes and Sink 'em, vast quantities of chemical munitions were loaded onto old battleships, which were then scuttled off the coast of New York in the Atlantic Ocean between 1967 and 1970. In 1969, details of that program were leaked to Congress and then to the press, and a public outcry halted it. Congress commissioned a study by the U.S. National Academy of Sciences, which ultimately recommended that instead these agents be incinerated or chemically neutralized rather than simply dumped into the ocean, where of course there are severe public health risks involved. The Department of Defense responsible for this stockpile adopted these incineration and neutralization processes as their preferred method. Alongside this, there was multilateralization of the chemical weapons destruction effort going on. In 1985, Congress mandated complete elimination of the U.S. stockpile. 5 years later, the U.S. and Russia negotiated a bilateral agreement limiting the amount of chemical agent that each could possess, again necessitating a certain amount of destruction. And finally, in 1993, the Chemical Weapons Convention mandated irreversible elimination of the entire stockpile. As this was pursued, there were significant cost growths and delays associated with the program. So when initially the incineration and neutralization techniques were decided on, DoD projected a cost of $1.4 billion to achieve complete destruction of the stockpile in 12 years. By 96, this had grown to $12.4 billion, and there was also at this time a switch from incineration to neutralization as the preferred method of elimination, which further increased costs. And at the present, about 90% of the stockpile has been eliminated, so while it was slow going, it did go. It's near finished, but projected lifetime costs for the program are somewhere around $40 billion and are likely to grow some in the future for this last 10%, which is in many cases the most difficult of this stockpile to eliminate. But despite that, we are nearing chemical disarmament. So of these 9 Army depots in which the stockpile was stored in the U.S., 7 are now devoid of any chemical weapons materials, and the last 2, chemical neutralization is underway at the Bluegrass Kentucky Depot and the Pueblo Depot in Colorado. So now, moving to the other case, weapons plutonium stockpile reduction, or at least attempted stockpile reduction. Weapons plutonium was first produced by the United States in 1943. Acquisition in 1948 by the Soviet Union established, as with chemical weapons, a deterrence role for this material, this weapons stockpile in U.S. Nuclear strategy. Under that deterrence context, rampant production continued until 1988. This resulted in a U.S. stockpile on the order of 10,000 spherical pits of metallic plutonium, alloyed with small amounts of gallium and a few other metals, but mainly weapons plutonium, primarily stored both in deployed weapons and in Pantex, the DOE's plant in northern Texas, for storage of these fissile material kits. There are a few different motivations for reduction of the size of this stockpile. One of the key is, of course, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which is viewed arguably as a treaty that traded non-proliferation by states that don't possess these weapons for disarmament by those that do. Despite that, has been relatively little progress on fissile materials reduction prior to the 1990s. As I mentioned before, the global plutonium inventory has monotonically increased since the late 60s. However, with the dissolution of the USSR, there was new impetus for achieving some reduction in the amount of plutonium that exists worldwide. The idea of loose nukes, for example, nuclear material that might leak from the former Soviet Union and be acquired by non-state actors or others, came to the forefront. There was renewed interest in a fissile material cutoff treaty that would halt the production of this material, recognizing it as a risk to global security. And alongside this, there was finally US-Russian talk about bilateral stockpile reductions. So it still wasn't the case that the US wasn't interested in this material. It was more that if we get rid of this, maybe the former Soviet Union will, and that will make the world a safer place. In this context, there were a series of meetings and quite rapid progress on bilateral stockpile reduction initiatives. In '92, it was discussed at a joint meeting of the US National Academy of Sciences and its counterpart, the Russian Academy of Science. 2 years later, the NAS published a comprehensive study, shown here on the right, Management and Disposition of Excess Weapons Plutonium, on the issue, laying out the options available. 2 years later, there was direct discussion between Clinton and Yeltsin at the Moscow Nuclear Safety and Security Summit, and in 2000, the PMDA, or Plutonium Management and Disposition Agreement, shown there in the title, was signed. It was then renegotiated and re-signed over the next 10 years. But ultimately, an agreement was produced that required irradiation of 34 metric tons of weapons plutonium by each state, Russia and the United States. Russia actually objected to the initial US preference for not irradiation, but dilution and burial of this material, arguing that it was, quote, just another form of storage. So irreversibility was a key issue here, the idea that this must achieve to some degree semi-permanent reduction in the size of the stockpile to be an actual advance in the disarmament of these two nations. Ultimately, however, the PMDA failed. Like the chemical weapons case, there was rampant cost growth. So in order to convert weapons plutonium to nuclear fuel that you can irradiate in a nuclear reactor, you need to have a quite technically complex conversion facility. Russia opened their conversion facility, shown here on the top, in 2015. The US initially estimated about $5 billion, so same order of magnitude as in the chemical weapons case, to produce this facility, to construct it, and to carry out conversion of the material to nuclear fuel. By 2014, projections for the cost had grown to at least $32 billion. Some stretch up to hundreds of billions. That kind of estimate relies on quite low yearly funding levels, so somewhere around 30 to 50 billion, on par with the chemical weapons case, is a reasonable assessment. In response to this cost growth, the US unilaterally pivoted from the irradiation approach mandated by the PMDA to what they initially preferred, dilution and burial, which, as you remember, Russia had vehemently objected to. This, of course, produced Russian anathema in 2016. Putin stated that under this planned dilution and burial approach, the US would retain its breakout potential. In other words, plutonium could both be retrieved, reprocessed, and converted into weapons-grade plutonium again. So Russia suspended its commitment to the PMDA. The agreement unraveled. So now I'm going to look at these two cases in a few different ways. You might remember the technology, the organization involved, and the sociopolitical context. So I'm going to start by looking at the technology, the technical basis for elimination of this material and aspects of the material itself. And the main question here is whether we have some explanatory power with this analysis. Did fundamental characteristics of the weapons materials themselves necessitate the divergent outcomes of these two reduction efforts? So if we look at chemical agents first, these are molecular liquids, with the exception of the chlorine gases, which consist of a single element, but the US chemical stockpile has never relied strongly on chlorine gases. It's mainly sarin and sulfur mustards. So these are composed of a few relatively common and relatively harmless elements. So I show here on the right the same sarin molecule, just with two different modes of representation. You see it's made of oxygen, which of course we breathe, fluorine, phosphorus, fertilizer, for example. The efficacy of these as weapons arises from the bonding of these relatively common elements. And that means that if you're going to eliminate them, you just need to tear those bonds apart, and you end up with oxygen and fluorine. These are safe elements. Weapons plutonium is quite different at a material level. This is an elemental solid, so it's composed of only a single chemical element, plutonium. This is a synthetic element that has to be synthesized through nuclear processes in a nuclear reactor. And its efficacy as a weapon arises not from the bonding of different elements together, but from the initial synthesis of plutonium. If you take a piece of plutonium and tear it in two, you still have two pieces of plutonium. It's equally weaponizable. That's different from the chemical agent case. So there are some implications for elimination here. Chemical agents, as I mentioned, you need to chemically decompose. You just break those bonds between oxygen and phosphorus, for example. Plutonium requires nuclear decomposition. You need to take plutonium and make it into a different isotope of plutonium that is no longer weapons usable or as weapons usable, or a different chemical element in the first place. So a clear question arises of whether we can really compare these in this way at all, or is this an apples to oranges situation where they're so different that it makes sense that they would have different outcomes. So I'm going to look a little more at the means of elimination that were pursued. So you might remember with chemical weapons, initially this was the dumping in the ocean. So placing these weapons in a place where retrieval is difficult or costly or observable, but the weapon itself remains intact. Later there was a transition to two new approaches, incineration, where you put this material in a high temperature furnace, which breaks apart the bonds in those molecules, resulting in relatively benign substances like oxygen. Or neutralization, which uses chemical agents to achieve roughly the same thing. A schematic of such a process is shown on the bottom, where when you react a serine molecule with an OH group, you get isopropyl methylphosphonic acid, which is a much less lethal compound, although still dangerous. And you do that again, you get methylphosphonic acid, which is, again, while a lethal compound method is much less lethal than serine and much less weaponizable. Through these induced chemical reactions, you're essentially breaking that molecule apart. If we look at the initial approach that was pursued for weapons plutonium, it's actually quite similar. We're not chemically changing the material, but if you take an atom of plutonium, 239 being the isotope that is most amenable to weaponization, bombard it in a nuclear reactor with neutrons, you can break apart that element into smaller, non-weaponizable or less weaponizable compounds. But what was finally pursued in the United States was not that. It was instead burial of this material, which is in many ways analogous to marine dumping. You simply place the material in a place from which recovery is more difficult, more challenging, more costly, or more observable. And so what we see from this is that we can establish kind of a rough, simple typology of stockpile reduction techniques where we can bin them into either destruction or disposal. Destruction entailing in some sense reversion of the initial synthesis of that weapons material. So intrinsic alteration, decomposition, either of the chemical structure or the nuclear structure of this material. Reversion of that is quite difficult. This is a highly irreversible process, and in many ways it's analogous to the disassembly that we've seen in stockpile reductions of conventional weapons like missiles and tanks and war elements. Alternatively, there is disposal. This relies on the establishment of some sort of extrinsic barrier to the recovery or use of that material. Because you rely on extrinsic factors, there is a potential for low irreversibility if the value of the material is high relative to the cost necessary to retrieve it from the place in which it has been disposed of. And what's really interesting here is that in these two cases, they evolved along opposite tracks. Chemical weapons destruction started with disposal, marine dumping, and later ended up with destruction. In the weapons plutonium case, it went the opposite direction, starting with destruction through planned irradiation of nuclear reactors and ended with planned disposal through burial in the geologic repository. The last thing that's important to look at are the costs associated with these. As I mentioned earlier, rough cost estimates for destruction of the two stockpiles were about the same order of magnitude. Costs for recovery from disposal are actually quite similar for the two of them as well. Deep ocean salvage of chemical munitions that have been dumped in the Atlantic Ocean would be expected to be around a few tens of millions of dollars. Mining in the deep geologic repository would similarly be a few tens of millions of dollars. So the cost of recovery is similar, and then there's the question of whether the value of that material, that weapons material, is similar, and of course it's not. One way to look at this is on a induced casualty per kilogram basis. That's just a rough idea of how valuable this material would be to a warfighter. And if we look at the efficacy on a per unit mass basis for chemical weapons, you might expect under ideal conditions a few hundred casualties per kilogram of agent. And of course, under ideal conditions for a nuclear weapon, it should be on the order of hundreds of thousands of casualties per kilogram, which is actually a conservative estimate. So this raises the issue of whether disposal is effective for both of them. And for chemical weapons, we see that it might reasonably be. It's not so valuable that you're going to spend tens of millions of dollars to recover this relatively low utility weapon. For nuclear weapons, that's obviously a much different case. The efficacy of disposal is not necessarily negligible, but at least questionable. So looking at this technical basis, we can make a few conclusions. First of all, similar analogous means of disposal and destruction exist for both cases. So this makes it seem that they are in some way comparable. Disposal is obviously effective for chemical weapons. Its efficacy for nuclear weapons, for weapons of plutonium, is more questionable. And so in the chemical case, we see a case where effective disposal was actually substituted for much more costly destruction, and that destruction mission was accomplished, or is near accomplished. And the plutonium case, actually, effective destruction was substituted with less effective disposal for cost-saving reasons. So because comparable technical means exist, it's valid to compare these two, but material and technical factors themselves don't explain this divergence in outcome. This all raises the question of why the Department of Defense was willing to pursue this more costly destruction method for the chemical stockpile when it wasn't really necessary. Disposal seems effective, while the DOE, faced with almost the same costs for destruction, quickly pivoted from effective destruction of weapons plutonium to a disposal technique. So next, we're going to look at the organizational factors at play. This being the second lens of analysis, in which I'll borrow from the organization theory literature. Now, quite different organizations were responsible for managing both of these stockpiles, the Department of Defense and subsidiary bodies on the chemical weapons side, and the Department of Energy and subsidiary bodies on the weapons plutonium side. A tenet of organization theory, as described by seminal work by March and Simon, looks at the conventional heuristics through which bureaucratic organizations follow when confronted with an unfamiliar problem. This problem of reductions, of course, being unfamiliar to organizations that were previously involved in the production and maintenance of stockpiles for use as tools of warfighting and deterrence. One of the most typical bureaucratic heuristics is to recognize a situation as being of a familiar, frequently encountered type, and then matching that recognized situation to a set of rules that an organization has established in its previous work. So this is a process of reproduction, the reproduction of prior problem solving to solve new problems. In that sense, adaptation takes place through a recombination of lower level programs that are already in existence. Now this sounds bad, but it's actually quite beneficial to large organizations. It allows them to efficiently make use of resources and capabilities that already exist, rather than trying to reinvent the wheel each time they have a new problem. But it can, in some cases, constrain organizational behavior, particularly when an organization is tasked with a mission that is wildly different from anything they've encountered before. So in those cases, because organizations solve certain problems and reproduce that problem-solving strategy, they can, quote, build organizational capacity to solve certain problems, but not others. And the key implication for reductions is that organizations tend to revert to familiar routines when tasked with new missions. And in the words of Allison, projects that demand that existing organizational units depart from their established programs to perform unprogrammed tasks like stockpile reduction are rarely accomplished in their designed form. And that's exactly what we see in one of these cases and not the other. So there's the question of why. We'll look first at the case where it plays right into this prediction of organization theory, the routinization of nuclear waste management. So this is a story, in one sense, of organizational inflexibility, or the inability of the DOE to adopt to a new unfamiliar mission. The DOE quickly abandoned irradiation of this nuclear fuel, switching to burial. This being the case where, in the words of Eden, knowledge-laden routines constrained its activity by appearing sensible or even inevitable. So the Department of Energy was quite unfamiliar, and is quite unfamiliar, with the production of plutonium-bearing nuclear fuel, or the irradiation of plutonium in nuclear reactors. There was limited development of this technology in the 1970s, including at San Onofre in San Diego. But in 1977, the Carter administration put a moratorium in place on the grounds that encouraging the civilian energy generation use of plutonium might encourage proliferation by creating an incentive for states to acquire and to justify their use of plutonium. Even though this moratorium was later lifted under the Reagan administration, there was little commercial interest in this technology because the plutonium was relatively expensive relative to cheap uranium resources. So there's been little domestic, commercial, or research activity on this issue. In fact, the US expertise in this area is so lacking that when initially pursuing this plutonium conversion and irradiation technique, the DOE had to rely extensively on Shaw Riva, a US-French firm, to acquire French expertise in how to do this, because of course France does have a large plutonium reprocessing infrastructure. In contrast, the DOE has a great deal of familiarity with the burial of nuclear wastes. So there has been a long-standing consensus in the United States that burial is the best solution to the management of most forms of nuclear waste. We can trace this back to a 1957 National Academies report, arguing that this was essentially the only realistic solution to this problem. Burial is in fact legally mandated for most nuclear wastes in the United States by the '82 Nuclear Waste Policy Act, and the DOE has key capabilities in this area and investments in this area, operating the Waste Isolation Pilot Plant, the only existing deep geologic repository for nuclear waste worldwide. And in fact, it was this facility in which burial of this weapons plutonium was recommended, giving rise to cost savings that would further incentivize this course of action. So, as predicted by organization theory, the DOE, as we might expect, quickly attempted to revert to its existing routinized behavior and substitute unfamiliar missions with that existing expertise. Congress chided the DOE in 2001, so this is 1 year after the PMDA agreement was signed, for, quote, consideration of alternative plutonium disposition and management scenarios, combined with a much lower than expected budget request. So even 1 year after being tasked with this mission, the DOE was trying to pivot back to other means of disposal it was more familiar with and thought it was better equipped to handle. The DOE, in this case, replaced their unfamiliar approach with one, or attempted to replace it with one that mimicked existing capabilities, giving rise to a situation where damaging interactions occurred because new unfamiliar tasks were superimposed onto old familiar routines. We have a much different story in the chemical disarmament case. Here, we saw significant organizational change within the Department of Defense. It appeared unconstrained by any prior routines and able to quickly abandon dumping in favor of this new, unfamiliar incineration or neutralization approach. So in the organization theory literature, a few possible drivers of organizational change are posited. These include the cycling of personnel, the imposition of some sort of external stimulus for organizational change, or finally the recognition of new opportunities for substantial organizational gain by those within the organization if a new mission is adopted. So we can next look at whether any of these different drivers of change might apply to the DoD chemical weapons destruction case, and we see that actually all of them do, giving rise to what can be termed a perfect storm for organizational reconfiguration of capabilities and the adoption of new missions. First of all, there were 15 years that passed between the cessation of marine dumping in 1970 and the '85 congressional mandate for destruction of the stockpile. This gave rise to a significant amount of time between the two for cycling of personnel, for the adoption of new techniques, for example. It also coincided with the '86 Goldwater-Nichols Act, which substantially reshuffled the management of the DOE, its organizational structure, again giving rise to a situation that was particularly amenable to the development of new capabilities and adoption of new techniques. Finally, there is this intrinsic characteristic of the DoD that is quite unique in its behavior. In the words of Allison, is characterized by effective apparent imperatives to avoid a decrease in dollars budgeted. So unlike many organizations which will attempt to do things as cheaply as possible to retain resources that might be used for other missions, because of its unique funding situation, the DoD is in many cases incentivized to adopt costly new missions as a way of capturing additional budgeted dollars from congressional appropriators. In fact, the impetus for the DoD to capture these dollars by recontextualizing chemical disarmament as a means of budgetary capture was shown by this congressional appropriators statement that they were, quote, disturbed to learn that individuals employed by the Department of Defense have visited the Congress with paid consultants to, quote, promote the chemical agents and munitions destruction program. So in this case, chemical weapons have been recontextualized as initially a tool of warfighting, later to a tool of deterrence, later to an aging stockpile that was not much benefit to anyone and had to be eliminated, and finally to an opportunity to establish new programs to capture new budgetary resources and to undertake costly, technologically complex new missions that would allow the DoD to expand its funding base. So concluding on this organizational analysis, we see that both organizations were in similar situations where they were tasked with new, unfamiliar reduction missions. Both followed common organizational heuristics that favored familiar activities, but while in the DOE case, this resulted in a swift pivot from the unfamiliar mission to a more familiar dilution and burial approach that ultimately led to the scuttling of the PMDA, the DoD was in a unique situation where it was able to reconfigure its capabilities despite that conventional heuristic incentivizing the use of old approaches, and it ultimately was able to carry out this challenging disarmament mission. So now I'll move to a third issue, the sociopolitical context, where a question that is raised by this is where these framings of chemical weapons and weapons plutonium as tools of war, as wastes, as opportunities for the capture of new budgetary resources might originally arise from. And here we need to look at the sociopolitical context in which reductions are pursued. So this last level of analysis wraps up a broad array of different factors, domestic political agendas, international arms control contexts, into a single analytical method. So for this, I'm going to borrow extensively from the sociology of technology, primarily the work of Langdon Winner on technological intersustainment between material technologies and the social environments in which they operate. So Winner argued that the adoption of a given technical system unavoidably brings with it conditions for human relationships that have a distinctive political cast. So this is just a complicated way of saying that technology can drive certain political arrangements. On the flip side, that technological system, quote, could not exist as an effective operating entity unless certain social conditions were met. So on the other hand, social or political factors drive technological decisions. So there's an intersustainment here, where neither could exist without the other, the political arrangement in which it's embedded, and the technology itself. And this gives rise to the opportunity or the possibility of disintegration of this socio-technical context for continued existence of the weapon as an effective operating entity. So in the words of Wynne Jones, weapon systems are, quote, the result of a rather fragile interplay of professional, technical, economic, and political factors, so a broad array of social factors, and the product of a coalition of interests and alliances that will disintegrate if not constantly reproduced. So this raises the possibility for disintegration of that intersustaining socio-technical context. The key implication for reductions being that if we can locate the locus of intersustainment and analyze its evolution over time, we might be able to, in some qualitative analytic method, look at why differences between these two cases might have emerged at this upper socio-technical level. Using a natural selection metaphor, Vandenbelt and Rip argue that the social variation and selection processes, that is, the social forces that drive the retention or dissolution of a technological system, result in the formation of a nexus or a social institution that carries and shapes that link between the technological trajectory, the material aspect of the weapon system, and its social selection environment. So in this case, we need to identify that nexus and then analyze its evolution over time. And for both of these weapon systems, deterrence relationships are that nexus between the material development of a technological system and the social environment that sustains its continued existence. So what we want to look at is the evolving deterrent role of these weapons over time. As I mentioned earlier, chemical weapons were, of course, initially actually used as tools of war, quite extensively in the First World War, because they were so well suited to dominant modes of warfare, like trench warfare, resulting in US mass production. But even when they weren't any longer used in the Second World War, there was non-use, they were still produced and stockpiled as tools of in-kind deterrence. In fact, use was avoided even in cases where the tactical advantages of using gas against entrenched enemy positions were undeniable. So these had clearly been recontextualized as weapons that served a different role, not one of warfighting, but one of deterrence. And this deterrence justification justified continued production through 1968. There was reassessment of this in the 1980s and 1990s, where these weapons were now seen as archaic tools of a bygone era. So it's not actually that they were any less effective. In fact, they were more effective than they were during the Second World War, because in the 50s, the V series of chemical agents have been produced, VZ and VX, for example, nerve agents, much more lethal than sarin or the G series. Their use, however, was relegated largely to developing world conflicts like the Iran-Iraq War, where they were used extensively alongside tactics such as trench warfare, human wave attacks that were quite reminiscent of the First World War. So while they were still effective, they were now somehow socially misaligned with contemporary US warfighting strategy. And in fact, in later years, the Gulf War in particular showed the US that, quote, retaliation in kind was not necessary or not necessarily required to deter the use of chemical weapons. So this deterrence context, the idea that the US, despite not wanting to use this weapon, needed it to, in some sense, prevent the use by others or achieve some other strategic incentive, had dissolved. This deterrent context had ceased to exist, and thus by the time chemical weapons, chemical stockpile reductions began, what Schelling termed a dominant negative preference existed. This is a situation where, according to Schelling, not having the weapon is preferred irrespective of whether the other side has it. So obviously that's something that can only exist, this dominant negative preference, if the deterrence context for stockpiling in the first place is dissolved. So in this case, elimination was prefaced by this disintegration of what, in the words of the sociologists of technology, was the intersustaining nexus that produced the resilience or persistence of the stockpile in the first place. We can then contrast this with the plutonium case, where there is some essential nature of nuclear deterrence in dominant US strategic discourses. There's a common statement, here's one by the US Congressional Commission on the Strategic Posture of the United States, that the conditions that might make possible the global elimination of nuclear weapons would require a fundamental transformation of the world political order. So we see here a case where clearly certain social arrangements serve to perpetuate the existence of this weapons system. If we look at the most recent nuclear posture review, we see a number of similar statements referring to the deterrence capabilities of these weapons as necessary, as unique and essential to preventing adversary nuclear attacks. And this also extends to the plutonium stockpile itself to some case. The sustained pit production manufacturing capability that is argued for by the nuclear posture review is justified in the case that plutonium allows the US to, quote, prepare for future uncertainty. This is an inherently desirable material that allows the US to hedge against unknown risks from a dangerous world. And this recontextualization extends to the very goals of stockpile reduction themselves. In '94, when the National Academy of Sciences first produced this comprehensive report that paved the way or demonstrated the contours in which future plutonium stockpile reduction efforts might proceed, they gave two primary motivations for reduction. The first being the risk that weapons or fissile material could be reintroduced into the arsenal from which they came. So this is clearly a disarmament context, a justification that conceptualizes weapons plutonium or its existence as a threat to international and domestic security. The second is the risk that either weapons or fissile materials could be obtained by unauthorized parties. This is a non-proliferation justification, which conceptualizes this material as inherently valuable, something that must be safeguarded and protected because its acquisition by others could be a threat to the United States. So while these kind of conflict in some way, there's a certain tension between these two justifications in how the plutonium itself is conceptualized. There is this focus on, to some extent, limitation of the nuclear deterrent role of this weapon. If you want to make sure that it can't be reintroduced into the arsenal from which it came, you want, to some extent, to erode that intersustaining nexus, to move to a world where there is, to some extent, less reliance on the existence of a plutonium stockpile to promote deterrence relationships between the US and the Soviet Union or the Russian Federation. In more recent reports from the Department of Energy, specifically those arguing for a transition from destruction by radiation to disposal by pollution and burial, different reasons or justifications for this stockpile reduction effort were given. In a 2014 report, identified, quote, a danger to national and international security due to proliferation concerns and potential use by non-state actors for nuclear terrorism purposes. Conspicuously absent was the arms control or arms limitation justification that had been abandoned, and instead these stockpile reductions were pursued only for the sense of non-proliferation, for preventing others to get this material In other words, there was concern with what has been termed the loss of influence over what happens to be the means of supreme political potency. So this material was not in any sense inherently undesirable, rather it was so valuable that the United States had to assure that no one else could get its hands on it. So this inter-sustaining relationship, this deterrence nexus, had revitalized itself in some manner. It remained stable over time rather than dissolving as in the chemical weapons case. And this is quite aptly demonstrated by a quote from a worker at the Rocky Flats plutonium production facility, talking about difficulties they were having with its closure, where he argued that, quote, the workers were building things, in this case plutonium pits. Now you're asking them to destroy things by dismantling the facility, and that's not a very feel-good type of job. So in this sense, if you contextualize plutonium as an inherently desirable contributor to domestic security, then actually the act of destruction is not the hypothetical use of a nuclear weapon, but rather destroying the US capability to produce more of this material and to stockpile it over time. So concluding for this sociopolitical analysis, we see that deterrence relationships act as a social material nexus that contextualizes these weapons as effective operating entities, and so enables them to persist over time as weapons systems. Disintegration of this sociopolitical operating environment can promote elimination, and that's exactly what occurred in the chemical weapons case. But in the weapons plutonium case, we saw countervailing forces where actually this socio-technical nexus remained resilient and allowed a strong social mandate for retention of this plutonium stockpile to emerge. So now, wrapping all of these up, all of these different levels of analysis, we see some interesting conclusions. First of all, that the social dimensions really matter. It wasn't technical aspects or material factors alone that determined the disparate outcomes of these two stockpile reduction efforts. Rather, it was the organizations around them that managed these materials, or the socio-political context in which these organizations acted, that seemed to govern the selection of means of elimination and the delegation of necessary resources to these elimination efforts. This gives rise to what we might identify as some possible preconditions for successful stockpile reduction. Those include the liberation of the organization handling this from path-dependent organizational constraints, the detrimental effects of preconceived notions of what is feasible or inevitable or the best path forward. And second, institutionalization of the undesirability of that weapon system in the first place. Of course, the common refrain being that you only get rid of a weapon that you don't want in the first place. So the question here is, how do you make something unwanted? Possible path forward for plutonium, applying some of the lessons learned from the chemical disarmament technique, might be first to assign this task to a new organization. This mimics a number of calls on the civilian nuclear waste side for the establishment of a new organization outside of the Department of Energy that is not similarly constrained by its long history of path-dependent bureaucratic heuristics. And second, integration with a more robust arms control regime, perhaps one focusing on fissile materials exclusively, might create a more resilient mandate for the elimination of this material. This could, for example, include work towards a fissile material cutoff treaty that might recontextualize plutonium as a threat to international security and reinvigorate the perception that its elimination might enhance the security of the United States. So thank you for listening, and I'd be glad to take any questions.